Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Matthew, here to give a brief overview of our microbes and metabolism unit. This is not going to be a full lecture note set, but just to give you guys a little bit of an arc about what we're talking about in this unit and why we've grouped these things together. I know from in the past, a lot of students have really struggled with this unit because it seems like we've got all of these different topics. I want to give this broad overview of the topic and why we're doing it this way, and then also give you a couple highlights. I'll put some other resources posted up on our Moodle site for you to work with as well, as you work on the finer details of the different aspects of metabolism. So the question you might ask is, why would you group microbes with metabolism? And the reason is that microbes are metabolic machines. So when we look at the history of life on Earth and we look at the diversity of life that we see, what we'll find is that there are lots and lots of different groups of things that don't have a nucleus. We would call those prokaryotes in the past, or the archaea and the bacteria now, the archaea being over on the left-hand side and the other groupings all being within our bacteria grouping. And the fact is there's enormous diversity, and they've been evolving independently for an extremely long time. First living things on Earth were microbes, were these non-nucleated cells, and they evolved many different metabolic pathways. So metabolic pathways like photosynthesis and nitrogen fixation and chemosynthesis and the formation of essential nutrients and methanogenesis and cellulose degradation and even luminescence. All these metabolic pathways evolved first in microbes and then later on were used in symbiotic ways, or co-opted by larger cells. So when we talk about what that early Earth was like, we could go back to, where Earth formed and when water formed. And what we'll find is that in that Precambrian time, there was this Earth that was being bombarded by radiation. It was this hot, gaseous planet. And before we had a stable atmosphere, we had microbes making sugars, breaking down sugars, and interacting with one another. This is a image that shows some stromatolite-like reefs, which is what we think would have been very prevalent in the early Earth. And then what we'd see is that sometime around 3.5 billion years ago or so, we get the first evolution of photosynthesis and the release of oxygen. And the formation of that oxygen atmosphere did not happen overnight. It took a long time. But once there was this rise of oxygen, what we end up finding is that created an ozone layer. It also created a dramatic metabolic shift to the microbes that existed. And those microbes that existed then had to do one of a couple of different things. They either had to join up with other organisms so that they could use oxygen. They had to move into oxygen-free environments, or they ended up becoming extinct. And what we'll find here is that sometime during that phase, that next phase of life, we see the rise of eukaryotic organisms in that group. So if we look at the arc of all living things on Earth, what we see is that most of the time, the dominant organisms on this planet were microbes. Now, when I talk about types of metabolism, there's lots of different types. And this is where I say, I'm just going to give you a really brief overview here, and we'll go into more detail later. But there's a couple of different broad types of metabolism that we look at. There are two big categories we could break things down into. There are the anabolic processes, the ones that take little things and they build them up into larger things. This would be something where you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere and then you're building carbon chains like in the form of carbohydrates. This would be, very much what we talk about in the process of photosynthesis. We also could see slight anabolic processes in our nitrogen fixation, where we're taking nitrogen gas and we're turning it into nitrogen compounds that can be used. There's also catabolic processes, and catabolic processes are going to break large molecules down into small molecules. This can be done for a few different ways. Obviously, the breaking down of carbohydrates is to convert the energy from one form to another so that we could make ATPs and we can use that to drive cellular process. We also will do this to recycle for example, nitrogens, and again, this could be ammonias, this could also be nitrates being broken down into nitrogens, creating one of those cycles that we talked about, how elements cycle through ecosystems. So the last little point I want to make about these metabolisms is most of the things that we think about when we think about living things tend to be eukaryotic, tend to be macroscopic. So the question is, how did all these metabolic processes become things that we find in eukaryotes? I know that I am very guilty of saying, when we're talking about photosynthesis, referring to plants doing photosynthesis, when in fact I know that plants did not evolve photosynthesis first. They only co-opted the process from bacterial metabolism that happened long before there were any plants on the earth. So our current model of how eukaryotic organisms evolved or acquired the ability to undergo these metabolic processes is through the process of endosymbiosis. And so this is the basic idea that once upon a time there was this ancestral host that took in aerobic bacteria, took on cyanobacteria, and these bacteria were not dissolved and broken down and used as energy, but were retained within that cell, and a symbiotic relationship evolved between the host and those endosymbionts that were taken in. After many generations of evolution, these became reliant on one another for their metabolic processes to survive, and that led to modern cells where we see modern day mitochondria and modern day chloroplasts as thought to be descendants of once ancient bacteria. We will go into this much more detail in class, but I wanted to give you guys sort of that overall picture of why do we talk about microbes and metabolism in one giant unit, and the reason is because really microbes are those metabolic machines, and we see those metabolic machines even today in modern day organelles. All right, I hope that helps, and obviously ask questions in class or take a look at some of the other resources that we posted in Moodle for this unit.